The doors of the pack hall slammed shut behind her before she even reached them. Elena Voss did not slow down. She did not turn around. She kept walking, her boots striking the frozen ground outside the hall, each step louder than her own heartbeat, though her heartbeat was loud enough to drown out the whole world. Behind her, inside that hall, 300 wolves had just watched Marcus Cole stand in front of the entire pack and say the words that ended everything. "I reject you as my mate." 5 words. That was all it took. 5 words to turn 8 years of hope into ash. Elena had felt the bond snap the moment he said it. It was not like a rope breaking. It was like something alive inside her chest had simply stopped breathing. 1 second, there was a warm thread connecting her to him, a thread she had felt since she was 17 years old, and the next second, there was only a cold, empty space where that thread used to be. She had known this was coming. She was not foolish. She had seen the way Marcus looked at Olivia Grant during pack meetings, the way he found reasons to stand near her, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her and hardened when he spoke to Elena. But knowing something was coming and living through the moment it arrived were 2 very different things. The cold air outside stung her face, and she welcomed it. It was easier to think about the cold than to think about the silence that had filled the hall after Marcus spoke. Nobody had said anything. Nobody had stood up for her. 300 pack members, people she had grown up with, people she had trained beside, people whose children she had once babysat, and not one of them had said a single word in her defense. She reached the edge of the gravel path and stopped for just a moment, pressing her palm against the trunk of an old oak tree. The bark was rough under her hand, familiar in a way that almost hurt. She had climbed this tree as a child. She had hidden behind it during games of hide-and-seek with pack pups, who were now grown wolves with families of their own. This tree had watched her whole life happen, and now it was watching the worst moment of that life unfold too. Elena breathed in, slow and steady, the way her mother had taught her long ago. In through the nose, hold for 3 seconds, out through the mouth. It was supposed to calm the wolf inside her, the part of her that wanted to howl out her pain to the sky. She would not give her former pack the satisfaction of hearing her break. She had walked out with her head high, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as anyone could see her. But nobody could see her now. She was alone on the path, the hall's lights glowing faintly behind her, and there was nobody left to perform strength for. Her shoulders dropped. Her hand slid from the tree trunk. For one moment, just one, she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She was 24 years old. She had waited 7 years for the bond to fully form, had watched Marcus rise through the pack ranks from a young enforcer to beta, had supported him through every trial and every challenge, had told herself again and again that his coldness toward her was simply the pressure of his new position, that he would come around, that fated mates always found their way to each other eventually. She had believed that with her whole heart, and he had just stood in front of everyone and told her that heart meant nothing to him. Elena wiped her eyes quickly, angry at the tears even as they fell. She was not supposed to cry over a man who had never truly chosen her. She was supposed to be stronger than this. She had been raised by a mother who taught her that a wolf's worth was not decided by another wolf's rejection, but by her own actions, her own choices, her own strength. Her mother, Sophie Voss, had died 3 years earlier from an illness that no pack healer could cure, and Elena often wished more than anything that she could speak to her now, just for 5 minutes, just to hear her voice again and ask her what to do next. But wishing did not bring the dead back, and Elena had learned that lesson early in life. She started walking again, this time toward the small cabin she had lived in alone since her mother's passing. It sat at the far edge of the pack's territory, near the tree line, close enough to be considered part of the packlands, but far enough that most members rarely visited. It had always felt like a quiet retreat before. Tonight, it felt like exile. The walk took nearly 20 minutes, and with every step, Elena replayed the scene in the hall, over and over in her mind, unable to stop herself. She saw Marcus standing at the front of the room, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers, even as he spoke the words that would end their bond forever. She saw Olivia Grant standing just behind him, arms crossed, a small and satisfied smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She saw the pack elders exchanging glances, none of them stepping forward, none of them questioning why a beta would reject a bond that had been recognized by the pack for years. It did not make sense. Rejections happened, yes, rare as they were, but they usually happened quietly, privately, not announced in front of the entire pack during what was supposed to be a routine gathering. Marcus had waited until the hall was full. He had waited until every pack member, every elder, every warrior was present to witness it. That was not an accident. That was a message. But a message to whom? Elena could not begin to understand what Marcus hoped to gain by humiliating her so publicly. Unless it was not about her at all. Unless there was something else happening that she did not yet understand. She reached her cabin and pushed open the door, stepping into the familiar warmth of the small home her mother had built with her own hands decades earlier. The fireplace was cold, the ashes from the night before still sitting in the hearth. Elena did not bother lighting a new fire. She simply stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the small room that held everything she owned in the world, and she realized, with a strange and sudden clarity, that she could not stay here. Not in this cabin, not in this pack, not in a place where the people she had grown up with could watch her be humiliated and say nothing. She moved to the small wooden trunk at the foot of her bed and opened it, pulling out an old canvas bag that had belonged to her mother. She began packing without truly thinking about what she was doing, her hands moving on their own, folding clothes, gathering the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to Sophie Voss, wrapping a small framed photograph of her parents together before her father had died in a border skirmish when Elena was only 6. She was not entirely sure where she would go. She had heard of lone wolves who lived independently, unaffiliated with any pack, surviving on their own skill and instinct. It was a hard life, dangerous in ways that pack life was not, but at that moment, danger seemed far more bearable than staying somewhere she was no longer wanted. As she packed, her mind kept drifting back to the moment just before the rejection, trying to find some clue she might have missed. Marcus had called a pack gathering that morning, saying only that there was an important announcement to make. She had assumed, foolishly she now realized, that the announcement might be about their bond ceremony, something they had discussed in vague terms for months but never officially scheduled. She had even worn her mother's old necklace to the gathering, a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon, thinking it might be a special day. Instead, it had become the worst day of her life. Elena zipped the bag closed and sat down on the edge of her bed, running her thumb over the crescent moon pendant still hanging around her neck. She thought about removing it, about tossing it into the trunk with everything else she was leaving behind. But something stopped her. It had been her mother's. It did not belong to Marcus, or to this moment of shame. It belonged to her, and to the woman who raised her, and she was not going to let tonight take that away too. A knock sounded at her door, soft and hesitant. Elena's whole body went still. For a wild, foolish second, she thought it might be Marcus, coming to explain himself, to apologize, to say the whole thing had been some horrible mistake. But she caught herself quickly. Marcus Cole did not apologize. He had made that clear enough tonight. She opened the door to find her closest friend in the pack, Grace Whitmore, standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her eyes red from crying. "I came as soon as I could get away," Grace said, her voice trembling. "Elena, I am so sorry. I should have said something in there. I should have stood up. I just froze. I did not know what to do. And by the time I found my voice, you were already gone." Elena stepped back to let her in, more out of habit than any real desire for company. It would not have mattered, Grace. Nobody was going to change his mind by shouting at him. "That is not the point," Grace said, following her inside, and glancing at the packed bag sitting on the bed. "Elena, what are you doing?" "Leaving," Elena said simply. "I cannot stay here. Not after tonight." Grace's eyes widened with alarm. "You cannot just leave the pack. Do you understand what that means? Without a pack's protection, you would be vulnerable to rogue wolves, to territorial disputes, to 100 things that could hurt you out there. Elena, please, think about this." "I have thought about nothing else since I walked out of that hall," Elena said, and her voice cracked slightly, despite her best effort to keep it steady. "I stood there in front of everyone, Grace. Everyone we grew up with, and not one person said a word. Not the elders, not the warriors, not even you. And I do not blame you for that, but do you understand what it felt like? To realize that in this whole pack, not a single person valued me enough to speak up?" Grace's face crumpled, and she reached out to take Elena's hands in her own. I value you. I have always valued you. I was scared, Elena. Marcus is beta now. Speaking against him in that room would have meant speaking against pack leadership, and I am ashamed to admit that fear won over loyalty tonight. But that does not mean you should throw yourself into danger to prove a point. Elena pulled her hands away gently and moved back toward the bag on the bed. I am not trying to prove a point. I am trying to survive what is left of my dignity. I cannot look at these people every day, cannot walk past the hall where he humiliated me, cannot watch Olivia Grant smile at me across the market square knowing what she took from me. I need to go somewhere new, somewhere nobody knows my name or my story. Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching her friend with an expression that mixed sorrow and understanding. At least wait until morning. Do not go wandering into the forest in the dark, alone, still shaken from tonight. Whatever you decide, decide it with a clear head. It was, Elena had to admit, sound advice. She was exhausted, both in body and in spirit, and traveling through unfamiliar territory in the dark, in her current state, was not wise even for an experienced wolf. She nodded slowly. All right. I will wait until morning. Grace stayed with her for another hour, the two of them sitting by the cold hearth without bothering to light it, talking quietly about nothing important, simply keeping each other company, in the way old friends do when words are not really necessary. Eventually Grace left, promising to return at first light, and Elena was alone again with her thoughts, and her half-packed bag, and the terrible, echoing silence of a home she was about to leave behind forever. She did not sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hall, saw Marcus's face, saw the way nobody moved to stop her from walking out. She thought about her mother, about what Sophie Voss would say if she could see her daughter now, packing to leave the only home she had ever known. She thought her mother would understand. Sophie had never been one to stay somewhere she was not respected, and she had raised Elena to have that same kind of pride. What Elena did not know, what she could not have possibly known as she lay awake in the darkness of her cabin that night, was that even as she grieved the end of one bond, something far bigger than she could imagine was already moving toward her from beyond the borders of the only pack she had ever called home. A black vehicle was already making its way along the mountain road that led to the pack hall, carrying a man whose arrival in the next few hours would turn everything she thought she knew about her life completely upside down. She had no way of knowing that the worst night of her life was about to become the beginning of something entirely different. Morning came slowly, gray light creeping through the thin curtains of her cabin windows. Elena had barely slept, but she rose anyway, moving through the motions of preparing herself for a journey she was not entirely certain she was ready to take. She washed her face in the small basin of water she kept by the window, dressed in sturdy traveling clothes, and finished packing the last of her belongings into the canvas bag. She was tying the bag closed when she heard the first sounds of commotion drifting from the direction of the pack hall, faint but unmistakable even from this distance. Voices, raised and urgent, carried on the cold morning air. Elena paused, her hand still on the strap of her bag, listening. It was strange. The pack hall was rarely this loud in the early morning, especially not the day after a gathering as significant as the one from the night before. Most pack members would still be sleeping, or nursing the quiet shock of what had happened. This sounded different. This sounded like alarm. Grace had promised to return at first light, and Elena found herself glancing toward the door, half expecting her friend to burst through it with news. But the minutes passed, and Grace did not appear, and the distant commotion did not fade. If anything, it seemed to grow louder. Elena told herself it was not her concern anymore. She was leaving. Whatever was happening at the pack hall, whatever drama was unfolding among people who had shown her no loyalty the night before, it was no longer her responsibility to worry about. She hoisted her bag over her shoulder and moved toward the door, intending to slip quietly into the forest and begin her journey away from everything she had ever known. But as her hand touched the door handle, something made her stop. A strange feeling settled over her, something she could not name, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with grief or heartbreak. It felt almost like the moment before a storm breaks, that particular stillness in the air that every wolf could sense if they paid attention. She stood there for a long moment, torn between the urge to leave and a growing, inexplicable pull to go back toward the hall, just to see what was happening. It made no sense. She had no reason to care anymore. and yet the pull only grew stronger, tugging at something deep inside her chest, something that felt almost like the bond she had lost the night before, except different, sharper, and entirely unfamiliar. Elena set her bag down slowly by the door, her heart beginning to race for reasons she could not explain, and she found herself walking back toward the pack hall instead of away from it, drawn by a force she did not yet understand but could not seem to resist. She had no idea that she was walking directly toward the man who was, at that very moment, standing in the middle of the pack hall demanding to know exactly where she was. Elena walked slower than she meant to, her boots crunching over the frost-covered path, her mind caught between two pulls that felt equally strong. Part of her wanted to turn back, to pick up her bag and disappear into the trees before anyone from the pack could see her again. Another part of her, the part that had just tugged her away from her own front door, kept pushing her forward, step after step, toward the noise rising from the pack hall. She told herself it was only curiosity. She told herself that any wolf would want to know what kind of trouble could cause such an uproar the morning after a rejection ceremony. But the truth, if she was honest with herself, was that the feeling in her chest was not curiosity at all. It was something closer to recognition, as though some part of her already knew what waited at the end of this path, even though her mind had no explanation for it. The closer she came to the hall, the more details she could make out. There were more wolves gathered outside than she expected for this early hour, clustered in small groups near the entrance, whispering to one another with wide eyes and nervous glances toward the doors. Elena slowed her pace even further, staying near the tree line, unwilling to be seen just yet. She was not ready to face the pack again, not after last night, not until she understood what was happening. She spotted Grace among the crowd near the side of the building and made her way toward her, staying close to the shadows of the trees until she could catch her friend's attention without drawing the notice of everyone else. "Grace," she whispered, tugging gently on her friend's sleeve. Grace startled and turned, her face flooding with relief when she saw Elena. "There you are. I was on my way to your cabin, I promise. But then everything happened, and I could not leave." "What happened?" Elena asked. "I heard the noise from my cabin. What is going on?" Grace's eyes were wide, almost disbelieving. A visitor arrived. Not just any visitor, Elena. An alpha, from the Northern Ridge pack. He came with 2 of his warriors, drove right up to the hall in a vehicle none of us had ever seen before, and walked inside like he owned the place. Elena frowned, trying to make sense of this. Northern Ridge was a powerful pack, one of the largest in the region, known for its strength and its influence in matters between packs across the territory. It was not unusual for alphas from allied packs to visit occasionally for diplomatic reasons, but something in Grace's tone told her this was not a routine visit. "Why would an alpha from Northern Ridge come here unannounced?" Elena asked. Grace shook her head slowly. "That is the strange part. Nobody seems to have expected him. Beta Cole was clearly caught off guard when he arrived. There was supposed to be a meeting scheduled for next month, some kind of alliance discussion between our pack and Northern Ridge, but this alpha came weeks early, and he did not seem interested in discussing alliances at all. Then what does he want?" Grace hesitated, glancing back toward the hall before answering. He walked into the middle of the hall, in front of everyone who had gathered for the morning meeting, and he asked a single question. He wanted to know where to find someone named Elena Voss. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. For a moment she simply stood there, certain she had misheard. "Me?" He asked for me by name? "Yes," Grace said. "And Elena." The way he said it, the way the whole hall went silent when he said your name, I have never seen anything like it. Every single wolf in that room could feel something in the air the moment he spoke. It was like the whole pack instinctively understood that this was not a small matter. Elena's mind raced, trying to think of any reason an alpha from a neighboring pack would come looking for her specifically. She had never traveled to Northern Ridge territory. She had never met their alpha, had never even heard his name mentioned in pack gatherings before. It made no sense that someone of his standing would drive across pack borders, unannounced, simply to ask for a low-ranking wolf like herself. Unless it had something to do with the rejection. Unless somehow, impossibly, word of what had happened to her the night before had already traveled beyond her own pack's borders, and this alpha had come to offer some kind of alliance protection, the way some packs occasionally extended sanctuary to wolves who had been publicly humiliated or mistreated by their own leadership. It seemed far-fetched, but Elena could think of no other explanation. "What did Marcus say when the Alpha asked for me?" Elena asked, her voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Grace's expression darkened. "He tried to deflect. He said something about you being a minor pack member, unimportant, not someone worth an Alpha's attention." But the Northern Ridge Alpha did not accept that answer. He pressed harder, and Elena, I have honestly never seen a beta look so uncomfortable in front of his own pack. It was as though Marcus was hiding something, and this Alpha knew exactly what it was. Elena felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. There was something happening here that went far beyond a simple rejection, something tangled and complicated that she did not yet understand, and every instinct she possessed told her that she needed to find out what it was before she made any decisions about leaving. "I need to see this for myself," Elena said, straightening her shoulders. Grace grabbed her arm gently. "Elena, are you certain? After everything that happened last night, walking back into that hall, in front of everyone again, are you sure you are ready for that?" Elena thought about the question for a long moment. She thought about the tug in her chest that had pulled her away from her own doorway, away from the path that led out of pack territory, and back toward this hall despite every reasonable instinct telling her to run in the opposite direction. She did not fully understand that feeling yet, but she trusted it more than she trusted her own fear. "I have to know why an Alpha is asking for me by name," she said. "Whatever this is, it is already my business whether I want it to be or not." Grace nodded slowly, releasing her arm. "Then I will come with you. You should not have to walk in there alone." Together the two of them made their way around the edge of the crowd toward the main entrance of the pack hall, drawing curious stares as pack members recognized Elena and began whispering among themselves, though this time the whispers felt different from the shame-filled murmurs of the night before. This time there was confusion mixed with something that almost sounded like anticipation, as though the entire pack sensed that whatever was about to happen inside that hall would change everything they thought they understood about the previous night's events. Elena paused at the base of the stone steps leading up to the hall's heavy wooden doors, taking a breath to steady herself. Through the doors she could hear voices, low and tense, though she could not make out individual words from this distance. She thought again of her mother, of the strength Sophie Voss had always carried with her, and she drew on that memory now, letting it steady her spine and lift her chin. Whatever waited on the other side of those doors, she was not going to face it as the broken, rejected wolf who had walked out of this same hall the night before. She was going to walk in as herself, unashamed, whatever the consequences might be. She placed her hand on the door and pushed it open. The hall inside was packed even more tightly than it had been the previous evening, every available space filled with pack members who had gathered to witness whatever was unfolding at the front of the room. Elena's eyes moved past the crowd, searching for the source of the tension that hung thick in the air, and then she saw him. He stood near the center of the hall, tall enough that he seemed to command the space around him without effort, his presence so commanding that even from across the room, Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she had never experienced before, warm and electric and entirely overwhelming. His dark hair was cut short and neat, his jaw set with quiet authority, and though his back was partially turned to her, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely restrained power radiating off him in waves that seemed to make the air itself feel heavier. Beside him stood two other wolves, clearly his warriors, both standing at attention with the disciplined stillness of soldiers awaiting orders. Facing them, looking distinctly uncomfortable, was Marcus, his arms crossed defensively over his chest, his eyes darting nervously toward the doors, as though he had been hoping for an escape that had not yet presented itself. Elena stood frozen at the entrance, unable to move, unable to look away from the stranger who had thrown her entire pack into chaos. She did not understand what was happening to her body, why her heart had begun racing in a way it had not raced even during the rejection the night before, why every instinct she possessed seemed to be screaming at her to move closer, to close the distance between herself and this man she had never met. And then he turned. The moment his eyes found hers across the crowded hall, everything else in the world seemed to fade into silence. Elena felt the air leave her lungs entirely. His eyes were a deep and striking amber, and the instant they locked onto her own, she felt something inside her chest ignite, a warmth spreading through her body that she recognized instantly, even though she had never felt anything like it before in her life. It was the feeling of a bond forming. Not breaking, the way it had the night before, but forming, whole and complete and undeniable, as though her entire being had been waiting her whole life for exactly this moment. Every single wolf in the hall seemed to sense it at the same instant, their heads turning one by one to follow the direction of the stranger's gaze, murmurs rippling through the crowd like a wave. Elena remained frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, staring across the room at a man whose name she did not even know, yet whose presence had just changed the entire course of her life in the space of a single heartbeat. The stranger took a step toward her, then another, the crowd parting instinctively to let him pass, and Elena realized with a dawning, breathless certainty that this was the moment everything she thought she understood about her life was about to be turned completely upside down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The stranger stopped a few feet away from her, close enough now that Elena could see the fine details of his face, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his amber eyes seemed to search her face, as though he were trying to memorize every feature at once. Up close, his presence was even more overwhelming, a quiet, controlled power that seemed to fill the entire hall without him having to say a single word. "Elena Voss," he said finally, his voice low and steady, carrying easily across the silent room. It was not a question. He said her name as though he already knew, without any doubt, exactly who she was. "Yes," she managed, her own voice barely above a whisper. "I am Elena. Who are you?" "My name is Damian Reyes," he said. "Alpha of the Northern Ridge Pack." The name sent another ripple of whispers through the crowd behind them, and Elena understood now why every wolf in the hall had reacted so strongly to his arrival. Northern Ridge was not simply a large pack. It was one of the most respected and powerful packs in the entire region, and its alpha commanded a level of authority that few wolves in this smaller pack had ever encountered directly. "I do not understand," Elena said honestly. "Why would you come here looking for me?" Damian's expression softened slightly, though the intensity in his eyes did not fade. "Because 3 weeks ago, during a diplomatic gathering between several regional packs, I felt something I had never felt before in my life. A pull, unmistakable, toward a bond I did not yet understand. It took my healers and elders nearly 2 weeks of careful tracking and investigation to determine the source of that pull. They traced it here, to this pack, to you." Elena's mind struggled to process what he was saying. "A bond? But I have never been to any diplomatic gathering. I have never left this pack's territory in years." "You would not have needed to be present in person," Damian said. "Fated bonds can sometimes form across distances under rare circumstances, particularly when both wolves involved are unusually strong in their bloodlines. My healers believe that is what happened. The bond formed the moment I was near enough, even without either of us realizing it at the time." Behind them, Marcus made a strangled sound of protest. "This is absurd. Elena is a low-ranking member of this pack. She has no unusual bloodline. There must be some mistake." Damian turned to face him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees at the sheer weight of the look he gave the beta. "There is no mistake, Marcus Cole. My healers do not make errors of this magnitude, and neither does the bond itself. But I find it curious that you would speak so confidently about Elena's bloodline when I have reason to believe you know far more about it than you are letting on." The color drained from Marcus's face, and Elena felt a fresh wave of confusion wash over her. What does that mean? What does Marcus know about my bloodline that I do not? Damian turned back to her, his expression grave. That is precisely what I intend to find out. But first, I believe there are things you deserve to know, things that should have been explained to you long before now. An elder near the front of the hall, a gray-haired wolf named Henry Doyle, who had served on the Pack Council for as long as Elena could remember, stepped forward hesitantly. Alpha Reyes, if I may ask, what exactly are you suggesting? Are you saying that Elena has some connection to a noble bloodline that this pack was unaware of? I am saying exactly that, Damian replied. My healers traced the origins of the bond signature they detected, and it led them to records of a bloodline believed extinguished nearly 3 decades ago, a line known for producing wolves of exceptional strength, wolves capable of abilities that most in our world only hear about in old stories. The Marsh bloodline. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Elena felt her knees weaken slightly. and she reached out instinctively to steady herself against the nearest wall. She had heard whispers of the Marsh bloodline before, old stories her mother used to tell her as a child, stories of wolves who could sense danger before it arrived, who could call on strength far beyond what their size or rank suggested, who were said to have played crucial roles in ending a great territorial war generations ago, before the bloodline was believed to have died out entirely. "That cannot be," Elena said. "My mother was Sophie Voss. There was never any mention of a connection to the Marsh line in our family." It was Henry Doyle who spoke next, his voice suddenly heavy with old memory. "Elena, your mother's maiden name, before she married your father, was Sophie Marsh." Elena stared at him, stunned into silence. She had known, vaguely, that her mother had a maiden name different from Voss, but it had never occurred to her that it might carry any significance. Sophie had never spoken of her own family history, had never mentioned any connection to a legendary bloodline, had lived her entire adult life as a quiet, unremarkable member of this pack, with no apparent ambitions beyond raising her daughter and tending to the small cabin at the edge of the territory. "Why would she hide something like that?" Elena asked, her voice barely steady. Damien's expression grew somber. "There are packs in this region who would have sought to control or exploit a wolf, carrying that bloodline, particularly a female wolf, capable of passing those traits to her children. It is entirely possible your mother chose to live quietly, away from attention, specifically to protect you from that kind of danger." The pieces began falling into place in Elena's mind, with a horrible dawning clarity. She turned slowly to look at Marcus, whose face had gone pale, and whose eyes refused to meet her own. "You knew," she said quietly. "Somehow, you knew about this before Alpha Reyes ever arrived here." Marcus said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "Tell her," Damien said, his voice hard as stone. "Tell her the truth, or I will have my warriors search your private records myself, and I promise you, whatever I find will not reflect well on your character in front of your own pack." The hall had gone utterly silent, every wolf present holding their breath as they waited to hear what their beta would say. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a long moment it seemed as though he might refuse to speak at all. But finally, with the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him, he exhaled a long, shaking breath. "I found an old letter among my grandfather's belongings several months ago," Marcus said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like shame, though Elena could not yet tell if it was genuine. "My grandfather served on this pack's council decades ago, during the time the Marsh bloodline was believed extinguished. The letter mentioned a surviving descendant who had gone into hiding, a young woman named Sophie, who had married outside pack politics, specifically to avoid detection." "And you realize that meant me," Elena said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I did some quiet research," Marcus admitted. "It was not difficult to confirm, once I knew what to look for. Your mother's features, certain traits you carry, small things that lined up with the old records. I became certain months ago that you carried the Marsh bloodline." "Then why reject me?" Elena demanded, her voice finally breaking free of the numbness that had held it. "If you knew what I was, why would you throw away our bond in front of the entire pack?" Marcus's eyes flicked briefly toward Olivia Grant, who stood near the back of the crowd, her earlier smugness now replaced by visible unease. "Because a wolf carrying that bloodline would eventually be sought after by more powerful packs, by alphas, who could offer her far more than I ever could as a beta of this pack. I knew that if word spread of your true heritage, I would lose you regardless, to some more powerful mate who could claim you the moment your bloodline was confirmed. I decided it would be better to end things on my own terms, before that happened, rather than be discarded once you understood your own worth." The confession hung in the air like poison. Elena felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat as she processed what he was truly telling her. He had rejected her not because their bond was weak or because he did not care for her, but because he had been afraid, selfishly and cowardly afraid, of losing status and pride once her true value became known. He had chosen to humiliate her publicly, rather than risk being humiliated himself later. "You knew what you were taking from me," she said quietly, "and you threw it away anyway, to protect your own ego." Marcus said nothing, unable or unwilling to defend himself further. Damien stepped closer to Elena, and though his expression remained composed, she could see the barely restrained anger simmering beneath the surface of his calm exterior. This man's cowardice is not your burden to carry, Elena. Whatever cruelty he has shown you, it reflects on him alone, not on your worth. Elena looked up at him, this stranger who had walked into her life mere minutes ago and already upended everything she thought she understood about herself, and she found herself searching his amber eyes for any sign of deception, any indication that this too might be some kind of trick or manipulation. But all she found there was quiet, unwavering sincerity. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked softly. "You said the bond formed on your end weeks ago. You could have simply ignored it, could have gone on with your life as alpha of your own pack without ever seeking me out." "I could have," Damien agreed. "Many alphas in my position might have done exactly that, especially given the political complications a bond with a member of another pack can create. But I have spent 3 weeks feeling an emptiness I did not understand, a pull towards someone I had never met, and the moment my healers confirmed the bond's origin, I knew I could not simply ignore it. Whatever this connection is, whatever it means for either of us, I intend to honor it properly." The hall remained utterly silent as pack members absorbed the full weight of what was unfolding before them. Elena stood at the center of it all, the young wolf who had walked out of this very hall the night before in shame, now standing at the center of attention for an entirely different reason, claimed as the fated mate of one of the most powerful alphas in the region. She did not know what to feel. Relief and vindication warred inside her chest, alongside lingering grief for the bond she had lost with Marcus, confusion over the sudden revelation of her hidden heritage, and something else entirely new, something warm and frightening and undeniable, that seemed to grow stronger with every second she spent looking into Damien Reyes's eyes. "I need time," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "This is too much to process all at once." Damien nodded immediately, no trace of impatience or offense crossing his features. "Of course. I did not come here expecting you to fall into my arms the moment I explained myself. I only wanted you to know the truth, and to know that whatever choice you make from here forward, it will be respected." It was, Elena thought, exactly the kind of respect she had never once received from Marcus in all their years together, offered freely by a stranger within minutes of their first meeting. The hall remained frozen in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, until Henry Doyle finally cleared his throat and stepped forward, breaking the tension that hung over the room like a held breath. As the eldest member of the Pack Council present, the responsibility of addressing the situation seemed to fall naturally to him. "Alpha Reyes," Henry said carefully, "this is a great deal for our pack to absorb in a single morning. A public rejection last night, and now a revelation of a hidden bloodline and a new bond entirely. I hope you understand our need to proceed with caution." "I understand completely," Damien replied, his tone respectful but firm. "I have no intention of forcing anything upon Elena or upon this pack, but I would ask that the Pack Council consider carefully what has been done here. Elena was humiliated publicly by a beta who, by his own admission, understood her true worth and chose to discard her anyway, to protect his own position. That is not a small matter, and I would hope your council takes it seriously." Henry's eyes moved to Marcus, who stood with his shoulders hunched, refusing to meet anyone's gaze directly. "Beta Cole, is what you told us the complete truth? You knew of Elena's heritage and rejected her specifically to avoid the complications it might bring you." Marcus hesitated, clearly searching for some way to soften his own confession, but the weight of the moment seemed to press down on him until he simply nodded. "Yes, that is the truth." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the gathered pack members, voices rising in a low wave of disbelief and anger. Elena watched the reaction with a strange, hollow sense of vindication. The night before, this same crowd had watched her humiliation in silence. Now, faced with the full truth of Marcus's cowardice, they seemed far less willing to stay quiet. "There is something else," came a voice from the back of the hall, and Elena turned to see Olivia Grant stepping forward, her arms no longer crossed, but hanging loosely at her sides, her expression uncertain, in a way Elena had never seen from her before. "Olivia," Marcus said sharply, a note of warning in his voice, but she ignored him. "I think the pack deserves to know everything," Olivia continued, though her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Marcus did not simply decide on his own to reject Elena out of fear for his position. He came to me weeks ago and told me about the letter he found, about his suspicions regarding Elena's bloodline. He told me that if her heritage became known, Powerful packs would seek to claim her, and he asked me to help him plan how to end the bond before that happened, in a way that would allow him to save face publicly. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. You knew too. Both of you planned this together. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simply fear of consequence, Elena could not tell. I am sorry, Elena. I did not fully understand what we were doing until I saw your face last night, when he said those words. I told myself it was simply business, pack politics, nothing personal. But watching you walk out of this hall alone, I understood how wrong that was. Sorry does not undo what was done, Elena said quietly, though there was less anger in her voice than she expected. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the sheer scale of everything unfolding around her, to summon the fury the moment probably deserved. Damien's warriors, who had remained silent and watchful throughout the exchange, exchanged a brief glance with one another. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered wolf with close-cropped hair, leaned slightly toward Damien and murmured something Elena could not quite hear. Damien nodded once in response before turning his attention back to the pack council. I do not wish to interfere in the internal governance of this pack, Damien said, addressing Henry Doyle and the small cluster of elders who had gathered near the front of the hall. How you choose to handle Beta Cole's conduct is a matter for your own council to decide. But I will say this clearly, so there is no confusion about my intentions. Elena Voss is my fated mate, confirmed through proper bond channels and verified by my pack's healers. Whether or not she chooses to accept that bond and join Northern Ridge is entirely her decision, and hers alone. I will not pressure her, and I will not tolerate any pressure being placed upon her by this pack either. Henry inclined his head respectfully. Understood, Alpha Rays. And on behalf of this pack's council, I offer our sincere apologies for the treatment Elena received here. We will discuss appropriate consequences for Beta Cole's actions, and for Ms. Grant's involvement, once this gathering has concluded. Elena barely heard the rest of the exchange. Her mind felt overloaded, spinning through everything she had learned in the span of a single morning. Not only had her fated bond with Marcus been a lie built on his own fear and ambition, but her entire understanding of her family history had just been rewritten in front of an audience of hundreds. Her mother, the quiet, gentle woman who had raised her with nothing but patience and love, had apparently spent her entire adult life hiding an extraordinary secret, protecting her daughter from dangers Elena had never even known existed. She thought of the crescent moon pendant still hanging around her neck, and wondered suddenly if it held any deeper significance beyond simple sentiment. Had her mother chosen that particular design deliberately? Was there some connection between that small piece of jewelry and the bloodline she had apparently spent her whole life concealing? Elena, Damien's voice, quiet and close, pulled her back to the present moment. She realized she had been standing motionless, lost in her own thoughts, while the hall around her had begun to shift and murmur, with renewed conversation, as pack members processed everything they had just witnessed. I am sorry, she said, blinking rapidly. This is simply a great deal to take in. I know, Damien said gently. You do not need to have any answers right now. I only wanted to check that you were all right. The simple kindness of the question, offered without expectation or demand, struck Elena more deeply than she expected. She looked up at him, studying his face properly for the first time since the initial shock of their meeting had begun to fade. There was genuine concern in his amber eyes, none of the calculation or self-interest she had come to expect from Marcus in recent months. I am not all right, she admitted honestly. But I do not think I will be all right standing in this hall either way. I need air. I need space to think. Then let me walk with you, if you will allow it, Damien offered. Or if you would prefer solitude, I understand that as well. I have no wish to crowd you during a moment like this. Elena considered the offer for a long moment. Every instinct told her that trusting a stranger, even one bonded to her by fate itself, was a risk she should approach with caution, especially so soon after being so thoroughly betrayed by someone she had trusted for years. But something about Damien's steady, patient presence felt different from anything she had experienced with Marcus, and against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. You may walk with me, she said, but I am not making any decisions today, not about the bond, not about leaving my pack, not about anything. I need time. That is more than fair, Damien said. Take whatever time you need. As they made their way toward the hall's entrance, Elena caught sight of Marcus watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his eyes that looked almost like regret. She did not stop to speak with him. Whatever they had once shared had ended the night before, and nothing he could say now would undo the damage his cowardice had caused. Outside, the morning air felt sharp and clean after the tension-filled atmosphere of the crowded hall. Elena breathed it in deeply, grateful for the momentary reprieve from so many watching eyes. Damien's two warriors followed a respectful distance behind, giving the pair enough space to speak privately, while remaining close enough to respond quickly, should anything require their attention. "May I ask you something?" Elena said, as they walked slowly along the gravel path that wound around the outer edge of the pack hall grounds. "Of course. Why did you not simply send a messenger, an alpha of your standing, coming personally across pack borders unannounced? That seems like an unusual choice. Most alphas would send representatives to handle a matter like this." Damien was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I have led wolves my entire adult life. I understand the value of careful diplomacy, of letting representatives handle sensitive negotiations. But this was not simply a political matter to me. The moment I understood what the bond signature meant, the moment I realized there was a wolf out there connected to me in a way I had never experienced before, sending someone else to handle it felt wrong. If this bond means what I believe it means, then you deserve to hear the truth from me directly, not through an intermediary." Elena considered his answer, turning it over in her mind. It was, she had to admit, a more thoughtful response than she expected. That is either very honorable or very reckless. Traveling across pack borders unannounced, into unfamiliar territory, based on a feeling you could not fully explain. A faint, almost amused smile touched the corner of Damien's mouth, the first sign of anything other than seriousness she had seen from him since his arrival. "Perhaps it is a bit of both. My advisors certainly thought it reckless, but I have learned over the years that some things are worth the risk, and I suspected, correctly it seems, that this would be one of them." They walked in silence for a while after that, the tension between them gradually softening into something more like cautious curiosity. Elena found herself stealing glances at him as they walked, trying to reconcile the powerful, commanding alpha who had walked into her pack hall demanding answers, with the quiet, thoughtful man walking beside her now, matching his pace patiently to hers, offering space rather than pressure. It was, she realized with some discomfort, entirely unlike anything she had experienced with Marcus, even in the earliest, most hopeful days of their bond. As they reached the edge of the hall grounds, Elena slowed to a stop, looking out toward the tree line that marked the direction of her own cabin. "I need to go home," she said. "Alone, if that is all right. I have a great deal to think about, and I think I will think more clearly without an audience." Damien nodded immediately, no hesitation or resistance in his expression. "Of course, I will not intrude further today. But Elena, before you go, I want you to know something." "What is that?" "Whatever you decide, whether you choose to accept this bond or not, I will respect that choice completely. I did not come here to take anything from you that you are not willing to give freely. You have already had enough taken from you without your consent in recent days." The sincerity in his voice settled something unsettled inside her chest, even as 100 other emotions continued to churn beneath the surface. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for that at least." She turned and made her way toward the tree line, leaving Damien and his warriors standing at the edge of the hall grounds behind her, and though she did not look back, she could feel his gaze following her the entire way, steady and patient, and entirely unlike anything she had ever known before. She had no idea, as she walked back toward her cabin, with her mind spinning through 1,000 unanswered questions, that her decision to leave the pack that morning had already been set in motion before any of this had happened, and that the choice waiting for her at home would soon collide directly with everything she had just learned in that crowded hall. The walk back to her cabin felt entirely different from the walk she had taken earlier that morning. Then, she had been pulled by an inexplicable force she could not name, drawn toward the pack hall by instinct alone. Now, she walked with the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her shoulders, each step slower and heavier than the last, as though her body needed extra time to process what her mind could barely comprehend. She thought about her mother constantly during that walk, replaying old memories in search of any hint, any small clue she might have missed over the years, that would have suggested Sophie Voss carried the blood of a bloodline once thought extinguished. She remembered the way her mother used to sit quietly by the fire in the evenings, watching the flames with an expression Elena had always assumed was simple contentment, but now wondered might have been something closer to vigilance. She remembered small moments of unusual instinct, times her mother had seemed to sense danger before it arrived, warning Elena away from certain paths through the forest that later proved to hide sinkholes or unstable ground, or insisting they leave a gathering early, only for a storm to break minutes after they reached shelter. At the time, Elena had simply thought of her mother as unusually careful, unusually attentive. Now she wondered if those moments had been something more, echoes of an ability that had never fully awakened in Sophie but might exist, dormant and waiting, within Elena herself. When she reached her cabin, she found the canvas travel bag still sitting exactly where she had left it by the door, packed and ready for a journey she was no longer certain she wanted to take. She stared at it for a long moment before setting it aside and moving instead to the small wooden trunk at the foot of her bed, the same trunk that had held her mother's few precious belongings for the 3 years since her passing. She had gone through this trunk many times over the years, mourning quietly over each familiar item, but she had never searched it with the specific purpose she carried now. She knelt beside it and began lifting items out one by one, examining them more carefully than she ever had before. There were old letters, most of them from Elena's father, written during the early years of her parents' bond before his death. There were a few pieces of simple jewelry, worn and well-loved, and near the very bottom of the trunk, beneath a folded quilt that had belonged to Sophie's own mother, Elena found a small wooden box she did not remember ever seeing before. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded cloth, lay a collection of old papers, brittle with age, along with a single photograph of a young woman Elena did not recognize, standing beside an older couple, in front of a home Elena had never seen. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was unmistakably her mother's, were written the words, "My grandmother, Eleanor Marsh, and her parents, before the war." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She unfolded the papers carefully, finding what appeared to be a handwritten family history, documenting names and dates going back several generations, all bearing the surname Marsh. Near the end of the document, in her mother's more familiar recent handwriting, was a short passage that Elena read several times before the meaning fully settled into her mind. "If you are reading this, my daughter, then something has happened that made it necessary for you to know the truth I have kept from you your whole life. I am sorry for the secrecy, but I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. Our family carries a bloodline that others would seek to control or exploit if they knew of its existence. I chose to raise you quietly, away from pack politics, hoping you would never need this knowledge. But if fate has found you regardless, know that I am proud of whatever strength you carry, and I trust you to use it wisely." Elena sat on the floor of her cabin for a long time after reading those words, the paper trembling in her hands, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks. Not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming realization that even in death, her mother had left her a piece of guidance for exactly this moment. Sophie had known, somehow, that this day might come, and she had prepared for it in the only way she could, leaving behind the truth for Elena to find when she was ready to understand it. The revelation reframed everything Elena thought she understood about her own life. She was not simply a low-ranking wolf who had been overlooked and undervalued by her pack for years. She carried within her the blood of a bloodline once considered powerful enough to shape the outcome of wars, powerful enough that a beta had been willing to publicly humiliate her rather than risk losing her to a more powerful suitor once her worth became known. She thought of Marcus's confession in the hall, the cold calculation behind his decision to reject her, and felt a fresh wave of anger rise in her chest, sharper now than the grief she had felt the night before. He had not simply failed to love her properly. He had actively chosen his own pride over her well-being, had planned and schemed with Olivia Grant to protect his position at her expense, knowing full well the pain his public rejection would cause her. But beneath that anger, something else was growing steadily inside her, something that felt almost like clarity. For the first time since the rejection, Elena did not feel like a victim of circumstance, discarded and unwanted. She felt instead like a woman standing on the edge of a truth far larger than anything she had previously understood about herself. a truth that connected her not just to a hidden bloodline, but to a fated bond with an alpha who had traveled across pack borders the moment he sensed her existence, unwilling to simply let the connection fade unexplored. She carefully folded the family history back into its wooden box and set it aside, then rose to her feet and walked to the small mirror hanging on her bedroom wall, studying her own reflection with new eyes. She looked the same as she had the day before, the same dark hair, the same tired eyes, the same features she had always considered unremarkable. But something inside her had shifted, some quiet reservoir of strength she had not known existed, now beginning to surface, and she wondered, not for the first time that day, exactly what she was truly capable of. A soft knock sounded at her door, and for a moment, Elena wondered if it might be Grace again, or perhaps Damien returning, despite his promise not to intrude. Instead, when she opened the door, she found Henry Doyle standing on her porch, his expression grave. "Elena," he said, "I am sorry to disturb you, especially today of all days. But there is something urgent I felt you needed to know, something that could not wait." "What is it?" Elena asked, stepping back to let him inside. Henry hesitated, glancing around the small cabin, as though gathering his thoughts before speaking. "After you left the hall, the council convened briefly to discuss what should be done regarding Beta Cole's conduct. During that discussion, one of our scouts returned from a routine patrol along our southern border, with news that has raised significant concern." Elena felt a chill of unease settle over her. "What kind of news?" "There have been sightings of unfamiliar wolves along our territory's edge, scouts believed to belong to a rival pack that has grown increasingly aggressive in recent months, expanding its territory through intimidation, and in some cases, direct conflict with smaller packs in the region. We had hoped they would remain focused on their current campaigns further south, but the scouts' report suggests they may be turning their attention toward our territory next." "I do not understand what this has to do with me," Elena said, though a growing sense of dread told her she already suspected the answer. Henry's expression grew even more solemn. "If word of your bloodline spreads beyond this pack, and given how many wolves witnessed the revelation this morning, I fear it inevitably will. It is possible this rival pack may see an opportunity. A wolf carrying the Marsh bloodline, unprotected and unclaimed, would be an extremely valuable target for a pack seeking to strengthen its own bloodlines through forced bonding or worse. I believe your safety may be at far greater risk now than it was even yesterday, before any of this began." The weight of his words settled heavily over Elena, transforming the personal crisis of the past day into something far more dangerous and immediate. She thought of Damien's warning in the hall, his insistence that she would face threats from other packs, now that her heritage had come to light, and she understood suddenly that he had not been exaggerating or attempting to pressure her into accepting the bond. He had been trying to protect her from a danger she had not yet fully grasped. "What do you suggest I do?" Elena asked quietly. Henry sighed heavily. "That is not my decision to make, Elena, but I would be failing in my duty to this pack, and to you, if I did not tell you that remaining here, unprotected by any strong bond, in your current position within our pack's hierarchy, carries significant risk. Alpha Reyes offered you protection through a legitimate bond this very morning. Whatever complicated feelings you may have about the timing or circumstances, it may be worth considering that his offer represents more than simple romantic interest. It may represent genuine safety." Elena sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, the wooden box containing her mother's letter still resting beside her, and found herself staring at nothing in particular as she absorbed everything Henry had just told her. 24 hours ago, her greatest concern had been the slow, painful erosion of a bond she had spent years nurturing. Now she found herself facing decisions about bloodlines, rival pack threats, and a fated bond with a stranger, decisions that could shape not just her own future, but potentially her safety and survival. She thought of her mother's words in the letter, "Trust yourself to use whatever strength you carry wisely," and she found herself wondering, for the first time since the chaos of the morning had begun, whether accepting the bond with Damien Reyes might not simply be a matter of fate or romance, but a matter of genuine wisdom, a choice that honored both her own safety and the legacy her mother had worked so hard to protect. But even as that thought settled over her, another part of her rebelled against the idea of making such an important decision out of fear or obligation, rather than genuine feeling. She had spent years bonded to a man who ultimately valued his own status over her well-being. She was not willing to walk into another bond, however powerful or well-intentioned, without first understanding her own heart in the matter. "I need to speak with him again," she said finally, rising to her feet. "Not because I have decided anything, but because there are questions I still need answered, and threats I need to understand more clearly, before I can make any choice at all." Henry nodded, relief evident in his expression. "I believe that is wise. Shall I send word that you wish to speak with him?" "No," Elena said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I will go to him myself. I have spent too much of my life letting others control the terms of important conversations in my life. This time, I intend to set them myself." Elena gathered herself quickly, tucking her mother's small wooden box safely into a drawer, before pulling on her coat and stepping back out into the cool afternoon air. Henry offered to accompany her, but she declined gently, telling him she needed to make this particular walk on her own terms, with a clear head and no additional pressure from anyone else's presence. She had not gone far along the path back toward the pack hall when she spotted a familiar figure moving through the trees ahead of her, and her heart gave an unexpected lurch of recognition, even before she could clearly make out his features. Damien was walking alone, without his warriors, his expression thoughtful and slightly troubled as he made his way along the same path in the opposite direction, apparently heading toward her cabin. They both stopped when they saw each other, standing several feet apart on the narrow forest path, sunlight filtering down through the bare branches overhead and casting soft, shifting patterns across the ground between them. "I was coming to check on you," Damien said, breaking the silence first. "I know I said I would not intrude, but after everything that happened this morning, I found myself unable to simply wait without knowing you were safe. I apologize if that oversteps the space you asked for." "You do not need to apologize," Elena said. "I was coming to find you as well." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of cautious hope that he seemed to be trying to restrain. "May I ask why?" Elena took a steadying breath, gathering her thoughts before she spoke. "Henry Doyle came to see me. He told me about scouts spotting unfamiliar wolves near our southern border, a rival pack that has been growing more aggressive in the region. He believes that with my heritage now known to the entire pack, I may be in genuine danger." Damien's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had met him, Elena saw something closer to fear cross his features, rather than his usual composed authority. "I feared something similar might happen. The pack in question, if it is the one I suspect, has been causing serious trouble across several territories to the south of here for the better part of a year. They have targeted wolves of unusual bloodlines before, seeking to strengthen their own numbers through forced bonds, and in some cases, far worse tactics. Henry suggested that accepting your bond might offer me genuine protection," Elena said carefully, "not simply as a romantic gesture, but as a practical matter of safety." "That is true," Damien admitted. "As my mate, you would fall under the full protection of Northern Ridge, one of the strongest packs in this entire region. Any pack seeking to threaten you would need to be prepared to face consequences far beyond what they might risk by targeting an unbonded wolf from a smaller pack. But Elena, I want to be absolutely clear with you. I do not want you accepting this bond out of fear, or out of some sense of practical necessity alone. If you choose to bond with me, I want it to be because you want this, because whatever this connection is between us, you feel it is worth exploring, not simply because it offers you safety from a threat you did not ask for." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity, and finding none. It struck her, not for the first time that day, how remarkably different he was from Marcus in this single, crucial way. Marcus had always centered his own needs, his own ambitions, his own comfort, even in the moments that most directly affected Elena's life. Damien, standing before her now, was actively trying to ensure she did not make a decision that served only her safety, while ignoring her own genuine feelings. "Can I be honest with you about something?" she asked. "Always. When I first saw you across that hall this morning, before I knew anything about bonds or bloodlines or rival packs, I felt something I have never felt before in my entire life. Not with Marcus, not with anyone. It frightened me a little, how immediate and overwhelming it was. I do not fully understand what that feeling means yet, and I am not ready to say I am certain about accepting a permanent bond after knowing you for less than a single day, but I do not think fear or safety alone explains what I felt in that moment." Something in Damien's expression softened at her words, a warmth spreading through his amber eyes that Elena found herself responding to despite every instinct telling her to remain cautious after everything she had just endured. "Then perhaps," he said gently, "we do not need to decide everything today. A bond, once formed, is permanent, and I would rather you enter into it with genuine certainty than with fear driving your choice. What if, instead, you allowed me to prove myself to you properly, over time, the way this should have happened from the beginning had circumstances been different? I could arrange for additional protection for your pack's border in the meantime, extending resources from Northern Ridge to help guard against the threat Henry described, without requiring you to commit to anything immediately." The offer struck Elena as remarkably generous, especially given how little he stood to gain from delaying a bond he clearly wanted to see completed. "You would do that? Extend protection to my pack without requiring anything in return?" "Elena," Damien said, his voice quiet but earnest, "whatever happens between us personally, I have no intention of allowing harm to come to you, or to the pack that raised you, simply because circumstances have not yet allowed us the chance to properly know one another. That is not the kind of leader, or the kind of mate, I wish to be." Tears pricked unexpectedly at the corners of Elena's eyes, and she found herself smiling for what felt like the first time, in what had been an incredibly long and difficult day. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you probably realize." They stood together on the forest path for a while longer, talking more easily now that the heaviest weight of the morning's revelations had settled into something more manageable. Damien told her a little about Northern Ridge, about the pack he had led for the past 6 years since his father's passing, about the responsibilities and challenges that came with guiding such a large territory. Elena found herself listening with genuine interest, asking questions, gradually allowing herself to relax in his presence in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar, and yet somehow completely natural. As the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, they made their way back together toward the pack hall, where word of the rival pack sightings had spread, and pack members had gathered once more, this time in genuine concern, rather than the shocked curiosity of the morning. Henry Doyle met them at the entrance, his expression grave. "The scouts have confirmed additional movement along our border," Henry said without preamble. "It appears the rival pack is indeed advancing our direction, likely drawn by word of the bloodline revelation that has already begun spreading through regional channels faster than we anticipated." Damien's posture shifted immediately into something more commanding, the warmth Elena had seen in him moments before, replaced by the sharp focus of a leader facing a genuine threat. "I will send word to my own pack immediately, requesting reinforcements be dispatched to strengthen your border defenses. In the meantime, my warriors and I will remain here to assist in whatever way is needed." Marcus, who had been standing near the edge of the gathering crowd, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "As beta of this pack, the defense of our territory falls under my responsibility. I should be the one coordinating our response, not an outside alpha, however well-intentioned his assistance may be." The hall fell quiet at his words, tension crackling in the air, as pack members exchanged uncertain glances. Elena watched Marcus carefully, noting the way his voice wavered slightly despite his attempt at authority, the way his eyes kept darting toward Damien, as though gauging his reaction. "Beta Cole," Henry said carefully, "given the events of the past day, and the Pack Council's ongoing discussion regarding your recent conduct, I believe it would be wise to allow Alpha Reyes's assistance in this matter. Our pack's defenses are not currently equipped to handle a serious confrontation with a rival pack of this scale, and pride should not stand in the way of our people's safety." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he said nothing further, apparently recognizing that further protest would only damage his already fragile standing within the pack even more. Elena felt a strange mixture of emotions watching him retreat, not quite satisfaction, not quite pity, but something more complicated, an acknowledgement that whatever else he had done, he was still watching his own authority crumble in real time, consequences finally catching up to choices he had made out of fear and selfishness. Over the following hours, the pack hall transformed into a hub of urgent activity as scouts were dispatched, defensive positions were discussed, and word was sent to Northern Ridge requesting additional support. Elena found herself drawn into the planning discussions more than she expected, her knowledge of the local terrain around her cabin and the surrounding forest proving genuinely useful as the assembled leaders worked to identify the most vulnerable points along their territory's border. As evening fell and the initial wave of planning began to settle into a more organized rhythm, Elena found herself standing near the edge of the hall, watching Damien coordinate quietly with his warriors and several of her own pack's senior wolves, his calm authority evident in every measured word and decisive instruction he offered. There was something deeply reassuring about watching him work, about seeing firsthand the kind of leader he truly was, not simply through his own claims about himself, but through direct observation of how he treated others, how he listened as much as he commanded, how he deferred to local knowledge, rather than assuming his own authority should override every decision. Grace found her there, slipping quietly to stand beside her. "He seems different from what I expected, based on the way he arrived this morning," Grace murmured. "I thought, given how he entered the hall demanding answers, that he might be arrogant, difficult. But watching him now, I understand why the bond formed the way it did." Elena did not respond immediately, her eyes still following Damien across the busy hall. "I am still not certain what I am going to decide," she said finally, "but I no longer feel afraid of finding out." As the night deepened and the pack settled into an uneasy readiness, preparing for whatever the coming days might bring, Elena found herself standing at a genuine crossroads in her own life, one she had not anticipated even 24 hours earlier. The rejection that had once felt like the end of everything she had hoped for, now felt, strangely, like the beginning of something she was only just beginning to understand. Whatever threat approached from beyond her pack's borders, whatever challenges lay ahead in untangling the consequences of Marcus's cowardice and her own newly discovered heritage, she found herself facing it all with a strength she had not known she possessed, until this single, extraordinary day had forced her to find it. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation and cautious waiting. Reinforcements from Northern Ridge arrived within 2 days of Damien's request, a disciplined group of warriors who integrated smoothly with the smaller pack's own defenders, strengthening patrols along the southern border and establishing a watch rotation that gave the entire territory a renewed sense of security it had not felt since the first reports of the rival pack's movement. Elena spent much of that time in quiet conversation with Damien, their relationship deepening gradually through countless small moments, rather than any single dramatic gesture. They walked together through the forest paths near her cabin in the evenings, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, their hopes for the future. She learned that Damien had lost his own mother young, much like she had lost hers, and that shared understanding of grief created an unexpected bridge of connection between them that felt entirely different from anything she had experienced with Marcus. She also learned more about herself during those days than she had in years of living quietly within her old pack's hierarchy. With Henry Doyle's guidance, she began working with one of the pack's elder healers to explore whether the traits associated with the Marsh bloodline might be present within her, and to her genuine astonishment, she discovered a heightened sense of instinct she had never fully recognized before, an ability to sense shifts in her surroundings, subtle changes in the forest's rhythm that hinted at approaching danger long before ordinary senses would detect it. It was this very instinct that alerted her, on the 5th night after Damien's arrival, to a change in the air that made her sit upright in bed, heart pounding, certain that something was wrong even before any alarm had been raised. She dressed quickly and made her way outside, finding Damien already standing near the edge of the tree line, his posture tense and alert, clearly having sensed the same disturbance she had felt. "You feel it too," he said, not quite a question. "Something is moving out there," Elena confirmed. "Closer than the scouts reported this morning." Within minutes, the pack's warning horn sounded across the territory, a deep, resonant call that Elena had heard only a handful of times in her life, each time signaling genuine danger approaching the pack's borders. Wolves emerged from their homes throughout the territory, moving quickly and with practiced discipline toward their designated defensive positions, the weeks of preparation and the reinforcements from Northern Ridge finally being put to the test. Damien turned to Elena, his expression a careful balance of concern and confidence. "I need you to stay back, near the hall, with the others who are not part of the defensive line. I know that may not sit well with you, especially given everything we have discussed about your own strength, but I cannot risk you being caught in the middle of an unfamiliar confrontation before you have had proper time to understand your own abilities." Elena wanted to argue, some fierce and newly discovered part of her instinct pushing back against the idea of remaining passive while others faced danger on her behalf. But she recognized the wisdom in his words as well, understanding that rushing into an unfamiliar fight without proper training or understanding of her own capabilities could put not only herself, but others at greater risk. "Be careful," she said instead, reaching out to grip his arm briefly, before he turned to join his warriors. "Always," he replied, and for just a moment, something passed between them, unspoken, but deeply felt, before he turned and moved swiftly toward the gathering defenders. The confrontation that followed lasted through much of the night, though Elena, waiting anxiously near the hall with Grace and several other pack members not directly involved in the defense, received only fragmented reports as messengers moved back and forth between the border and the hall. The rival pack, it seemed, had underestimated the strength of the combined defenses now protecting the territory, and faced with the disciplined coordination between Northern Ridge's warriors and the smaller pack's own defenders, their advance was turned back well before reaching any of the territory's inhabited areas. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, word finally reached the anxious group waiting at the hall that the threat had been successfully repelled, the rival pack retreating back across the border, with clear understanding that this territory was no longer the easy target they had apparently believed it to be. There had been injuries among the defenders, though nothing that the pack's healers could not treat, and remarkably, no wolf on either side had lost their life during the confrontation, a testament to the careful, disciplined approach both Damien and the pack's own leadership had insisted upon throughout the preparation. Elena found Damien near the edge of the territory as the sun rose fully over the treetops, tired but unharmed, overseeing the final stages of securing the border before the exhausted warriors could finally return home to rest. He looked up as she approached, and despite the exhaustion evident in his posture, his face broke into a genuine smile at the sight of her. "It is over," he said simply. "For now, at least. I do not believe they will attempt another advance anytime soon, not after the losses they suffered tonight." Elena closed the remaining distance between them without hesitation, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce embrace that surprised them both with its intensity. Damien returned the embrace immediately, holding her close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply grateful for the safety of the moment after a night of genuine fear and uncertainty. "Thank you," Elena murmured against his shoulder, "for protecting my pack, for protecting me." "You do not need to thank me for that," Damien said quietly. "I would have done it regardless of any bond between us. But Elena, watching this territory fight to protect itself tonight, watching you stand strong through all of this uncertainty, I find myself more certain than ever that whatever this connection between us is, it is worth everything it might ask of either of us." Elena pulled back slightly to look up at him, studying his tired but sincere expression, and she realized, with a clarity that felt entirely different from the confusion and fear that had marked the beginning of this extraordinary week, that she was ready. "I want to accept the bond," she said. "Not because of the threat we just faced, and not because Henry believes it would be wise for my safety. I want to accept it because over these past few days, I have come to know you as someone genuinely worth trusting, someone who values my choices and my strength, rather than trying to control or diminish them. I want to build something real with you, Damien Reyes, on my own terms and in my own time, starting now." The joy that spread across Damien's face at her words was unlike anything Elena had witnessed from him before, a warmth so genuine and complete that it seemed to erase every trace of the night's exhaustion entirely. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. "I do not need an answer given in the emotion of this moment. I am content to wait as long as you need." "I am certain," Elena said, and she found that she truly was, the words settling into her chest with a rightness that felt entirely different from the uncertain hope she had once carried for her bond with Marcus. The formal bonding ceremony took place 3 days later, once the border had been fully secured, and the exhausted defenders had rested, held not in the pack hall where Elena had once been so cruelly humiliated, but in the open meadow beyond her cabin, beneath the same old oak tree she had leaned against on the worst night of her life. Nearly the entire pack gathered to witness it, alongside a contingent from Northern Ridge, who had traveled to see their alpha's bond formally recognized, and even Henry Doyle stood at the front of the gathering, his weathered face beaming with genuine pride as he presided over the ceremony. Marcus was not present. In the days following the border confrontation, the Pack Council had formally stripped him of his position as Beta, citing his deliberate deception and cowardly treatment of Elena as fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of Pack leadership. He had chosen to leave the territory entirely, rather than remain as a lower-ranking member among wolves who now knew the full truth of his actions, and Elena, standing beneath the oak tree in a simple dress that had belonged to her mother, found that she felt no lingering anger toward him, only a quiet sense of closure. Whatever pain he had caused her, it had ultimately led her to a truth about herself, and to a bond far more genuine than anything she had shared with him, and she found she could release the last of her resentment without difficulty. Olivia Grant remained within the pack, having been formally reprimanded by the council but allowed to stay, given her eventual honesty during the crisis, and Elena passed her occasionally in the following weeks, with nothing more than a polite, distant nod, the two of them settling into an unspoken understanding that whatever had happened between them was firmly in the past. As the bonding ceremony reached its conclusion, and Damien took Elena's hands in his own before the gathered crowd, reciting the ancient words that would formally seal their connection before Pack and Fate alike, Elena felt the last remnants of her old life falling away entirely, replaced by a warmth and certainty she had never known before. When Damien finally leaned forward to seal the bond, the crowd erupted into genuine celebration, a stark and beautiful contrast to the silent shame of the night that had once seemed to define her entire future. In the weeks that followed, Elena formally relocated to Northern Ridge territory as Damien's mate and future Luna, though she made frequent visits back to her home pack, determined to maintain the connections and community that had shaped her, even as she embraced this new chapter of her life. She continued working with healers to better understand the abilities of her rediscovered bloodline, gradually growing more confident in her own strength and instincts with each passing month. Grace visited often, delighted to see her closest friend thriving in a life so far removed from the humiliation she had witnessed on that terrible night, and Henry Doyle remained a trusted advisor and friend, proud to have played a small role in guiding Elena through the most transformative week of her life. Elena often thought back to that night, standing outside the pack hall after Marcus's rejection, certain that her life had reached its lowest and most painful point. She understood now, with the clarity that only time and distance could provide, that the very moment which had felt like an ending had instead been the beginning of everything that truly mattered, a doorway she had walked through alone in shame, only to find, waiting just beyond it, a life and a love far greater than anything she had allowed herself to imagine before. The crescent moon pendant that had once belonged to her mother still hung around her neck, a quiet reminder of the woman who had protected her secret for so long, and who, Elena felt certain, would be deeply proud of the strength and grace with which her daughter had ultimately claimed her own extraordinary destiny.